In the gilded cages of Mayfair, a woman's reputation is her only currency, unless she possesses enough fire to burn the ledger entirely. But when a fierce, rebellious heiress meets an unyielding wall of respectability, the resulting collision threatens to consume them both. This is a story of razor-sharp wit, desperate deceptions, and the dangerous line where a manufactured war becomes an undeniable surrender. If you find yourself lost in this tale of fire and truth, subscribe for the next chapter. Tell us in the comments, would you choose the safety of duty or the peril of desire? Chapter 1. The Third Strike. The ballroom of Mayfair did not merely whisper when Lady Isabella Thorne crossed the threshold. It parted like the Red Sea before an encroaching storm. Tonight, she wore a silk gown the colour of crushed rubies, a deliberate, flagrant violation of the pastel conformance demanded of unmarried young ladies. It was her third season, an eternity in the cruel arithmetic of the ton, and Isabella had long since ceased to care about the delicate sensibilities of matchmaking mammas. They called her the Inferno. They spoke in hushed, thrilled tones of the Earl of Malmesbury, left stranded at the altar of St. George's 2 springs ago, while Isabella galloped toward the coast in a pair of buckskin breeches. They recounted with terror the duel she had nearly provoked between 2 foolish viscounts, only to laugh in their faces and withdraw her hand entirely. She was dangerous, she was unmanageable, and most unforgivably, she was entirely wealthy. Isabella smoothed the rich silk over her hip, her knuckles white against the carved ivory of her fan. Outwardly, her countenance was an immaculate mask of bored disdain. Inwardly, a hollow, thumping ache resonated beneath her ribs. The rebellion was exhausting, but the alternative, yielding to some tyrannical lord who wished to trade her inheritance for her total submission, was death. "You look as though you are contemplating murder, Bella," a dry, gravelly voice rumbled behind her. Isabella did not flinch. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over her father, the Duke of Averley. The lines in his face had deepened over the last 3 years, carved by the sheer embarrassment of her public defiances. Beside him stood a man she had never seen before. The stranger was a wall of granite in a perfectly tailored, though noticeably unadorned, black evening coat. He lacked the peacock dandyism of the young men currently eyeing Isabella from the edges of the dance floor. His cravat was knotted with mathematically precise symmetry. His posture was so unyielding he might have been hewn from the very foundations of Westminster. He was broad-shouldered, with thick, dark hair brushed back from a severe brow and eyes the colour of a winter sea, cool, grey, and entirely unreadable. "Father," Isabella said, her voice dripping with sweet poison, "I merely find the air in here stifling, too many sheep in one pen." "Then it is fortunate I am removing you from the pasture," the Duke replied, his tone devoid of its usual bluster, replaced instead by a chilling, absolute finality. "Isabella, allow me to present Mr. Alistair Ellis." Isabella offered a curt, mocking inclination of her head. "Mr. Ellis, I believe I have not had the pleasure of your dull acquaintance." "The lack of pleasure is entirely mine, Lady Isabella," Alistair Ellis replied. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, smooth as aged brandy and completely unbothered by her prickles. He did not bow low, he merely regarded her with an steady, analytical gaze that made her skin prickle beneath her lace gloves. "Mr. Ellis is a man of impeccable standing," the Duke continued, a grim smile touching his lips. "A gentleman of rare rectitude. The sort of man who does not tolerate public spectacles, Bella, and as of this morning he is your betrothed." The ivory guards of Isabella's fan snapped in her grip with a sharp, echoing crack. "I beg your pardon?" 30 days, her father whispered, leaning in so close she could smell the snuff on his lapel. "You will marry Mr. Ellis within the month, or I will invoke the terms of your grandfather's secondary covenant. You will be stripped of every farthing of the Averley fortune, cast out of this house, and left to rot in the country with nothing but your infernal reputation to keep you warm. I am finished, Isabella. This is your third strike." Isabella felt the blood rush to her ears, a roaring torrent of panic and fury. She looked from her father's obstinate face to Alistair Ellis. The man had not blinked. He stood there, a monument of respectability, watching her look at him as if she were a complicated mathematical problem he had already solved. "You cannot be serious," Isabella hissed, her gaze locking onto Ellis. "Look at him. He is practically a church warden. He will die of apoplexy within a week of my company." "I assure you, Lady Isabella," Ellis said softly, taking a single step forward. The subtle scent of rain and fine wool drifted from him, cutting through the heavy perfumes of the ballroom. "My constitution is remarkably resilient. I have managed far greater crises than a lady with a fondness for theatricality." Theatricality. The insult hit its mark, burning through her veins. She saw what he was, a safe, dull pawn her father had bought and paid for to bring her to heel. A man who would trade his freedom for a duke's favour and a life of quiet luxury. "You think you can weather me, Mr. Ellis?" she whispered, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, untamed heat. Alistair Ellis looked down at her. His expression remains perfectly placid, though a strange fleeting shadow passed through his grey eyes, something cold, deliberate, and fiercely calculated. "A storm, my lady, is merely weather," Ellis murmured, his gaze dropping to her tightly clenched hands before rising to meet her furious stare. "And with a stout roof and a steady fire, any man can survive the winter. I look forward to our 30 days. The carriage rattled through the gloom of a late autumn dusk, bearing them toward the Ellis ancestral seat. Within the confines of the velvet-lined coach, the silence was suffocating. Isabella sat rigidly against the cushions, her chin tilted at an aggressive angle, though her fingers trembled beneath her cloak. Her wedding gown was a severe midnight blue velvet. She had flatly refused to wear white, and it felt like armour that had suddenly grown too heavy to bear. Opposite her sat her new husband. Alistair had not spoken since they crossed the London border. He was reading a small leather-bound notebook by the erratic light of the carriage lamp, his long fingers turning the pages with methodical, maddening calm. "Are you calculating how much my father's draft will fetch at the Bank of England, Mr. Ellis?" Isabella asked, her voice cutting through the rumble of the wheels like a razor. "Or perhaps you are drafting a list of rules for my confinement?" Alistair did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading, closed the ledger with a soft, decisive snap, and rested his hands upon his knees. "Neither, Lady Isabella. I am merely reviewing the estate accounts, and as we are now legally bound, you may call me Alistair." "I shall call you whatever I please," she snapped, her chest heaving against the tight constraints of her corset. "And do not look so smug. You think you have won a prize, but you have merely purchased a curse. If you think I will play the dutiful, quiet wife to a man who sold his name for a duke's gold, you are grievously mistaken." "I have never harboured any illusions about your compliance, my lady," he replied smoothly. His grey eyes caught the flickering lamplight, turning them to molten silver. "Nor did I expect peace." The carriage jolted violently as it turned down a long, overgrown avenue of ancient oaks. Through the rain-streaked window, the ancestral home of the Ellises finally loomed out of the darkness. Isabella's breath caught, not in awe, but in sharp surprise. It was a fortress of fading grandeur, a sprawling Elizabethan manor house built of dark stone, but the ivy grew wild and untamed over the mullioned windows, and several chimney pots were missing from the roofline. As the carriage ground to a halt, the front door was opened not by a phalanx of powdered footmen, but by a solitary, silver-haired butler whose livery was impeccably brushed but visibly frayed at the cuffs. The interior was no better. The grand entrance hall boasted soaring arched ceilings and magnificent oak panelling, but the air was draughty, and the massive hearth held only a modest, flickering fire. The grand tapestries on the walls were faded, leaving pale ghosts where older, more valuable treasures had clearly been removed. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," Alistair said, stepping down and offering her his hand. Isabella ignored his fingers, gathering her heavy skirts and stepping past him onto the cold stone floor. She turned on her heel to face him, the firelight catching the sharp, beautiful lines of her furious countenance. "A bit draughty for a monument of respectability, isn't it? Tell me, Mr. Ellis, did my father pay you in advance, or do you require a down payment to fix the roof?" Alistair closed the heavy oak door himself, nodding a polite dismissal to the aging butler. Once they were entirely alone in the cavernous hall, the mask of the stoic gentleman did not slip, but it hardened into something altogether more formidable. He walked slowly toward her, his boots echoing against the stone. "You have a sharp tongue, Isabella," he murmured, stopping just a breath away from her. He was a head taller, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow that enveloped her entirely. But a sharp tongue cannot heat a room or mend a roof. I suggest you change out of your travelling clothes. Supper will be served in the library. It is the only room small enough to keep warm. We will not be having supper, Mr. Ellis. We will be having a negotiation. From the deep folds of her velvet cloak, Isabella produced a folded piece of heavy vellum, sealed with her own private crest in black wax. She held it out between them like a weapon. Alistair looked down at the document, one dark eyebrow arching. And what is this? A secret clause. A private contract between the two predators in this house, Isabella said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low whisper. She stepped closer, determined not to let him intimidate her with his height. A marriage in name only. We will maintain the appearance of a union for exactly 366 days to satisfy my father and the gossips. You will sleep in your quarters. I will sleep in mine. You will not touch me. You will not attempt to govern me. Alistair reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the vellum. A sudden, sharp jolt of electricity shot up Isabella's arm at the brief contact, making her breath hitch, but she refused to step back. And what do I receive in exchange for this remarkable deprivation? Alistair asked, unfolding the paper. His eyes scanned the neat, elegant script she had spent the previous night drafting. Double, Isabella said triumphantly, her confidence returning. From my mother's private, unentailed inheritance, which comes to me unconditionally on my next birthday. I will pay you double the sum my father gave you to marry me. All you have to do is grant me an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation after 1 year. You get your fortune, and I get my absolute freedom. Do we have a deal, or must I make your life an absolute hell starting tonight? Alistair read the contract to the very end. For a long, agonizing moment, the library was silent save for the howling of the wind in the chimney. Isabella watched him, expecting a lecture on propriety, a burst of masculine outrage, or a haughty refusal. Instead, Alistair Ellis slowly folded the paper, slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat, and looked down at her with a chilling, professional calm that made her spine go cold. Very well, he said softly. Isabella blinked, thrown entirely off balance. You accept? Just like that? No protests? No demands for your husbandly rights? You have offered me a highly logical business proposition, Lady Isabella, Alistair said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. I am a practical man. I accept your terms. He turned away to stir the dying embers of the hearth, his back to her. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of the draughty hall, a strange, hollow sensation opening up in her stomach. She had won. She had secured her freedom. Yet, looking at the unyielding line of Alistair's shoulders, she felt less like a victor and more like a creature that had just willingly walked into a beautifully constructed trap. What Isabella did not see, as Alistair kept his back to her, was the way his jaw clenched until the bone showed white against his tanned skin. She did not know that in his desk upstairs lay 3 separate notices of foreclosure from London creditors, each bearing a date less than a week away. She did not know that his 2 younger sisters, currently staying with a distant aunt in Bath, were on the verge of being cast into the street, or that the dowry her father had provided had already been drafted away that very morning to save the roof over his tenants' heads. He didn't just want her money. He needed it to survive. Alistair turned back to her, his grey eyes completely masked once more. The contract is agreed, my lady, but let us establish one boundary of our own. This house is small and the winter is long. If we are to wage this war, let us do so with the understanding that I do not break easily. You may try your worst to shock me, Isabella, but you will find that granite does not yield to fire. Isabella drew herself up, her ruby lips curving into a dangerous, defiant smile. We shall see about that, Mr. Ellis, we shall see. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Manipulation. The War of Blackwood Manor did not begin with a grand declaration, but with a succession of small, calculated outrages. Isabella was determined to drive her husband to the absolute brink of his formidable patience. If she could force him into a towering rage, into a public scandal that fractured his precious veneer of respectability, the facade of their marriage would shatter early, and she would prove that she was the one who held the reins. Her first salvo was a midnight card game, thrown in the grand salon beneath a draughty chandelier that had not been fully lit in a decade. She had invited a scandalous assortment of characters from the neighbouring estates, a rakish baronet known for his racing debts, a local squire's eccentric daughters, and a disgraced French émigré. The brandy flowed like water, paid for out of her own pin money, and Isabella sat at the centre of the table, laughing too loudly, a glass of dark claret held loosely in her fingers. She wore a gown of gossamer emerald silk with a neckline that was an accidental masterpiece of exposure, daring any decent gentleman to look her in the eye. Alistair entered the room at midnight. He did not shout. He did not order the guests out into the freezing rain. Instead, he walked calmly to the sideboard, poured himself a single finger's width of scotch, and moved through the room with the devastating, polite indifference of a monarch visiting a peasant village. "Ah, Sir John," Alistair murmured, adjusting a candle that was guttering near the window. "I trust your horse performed better at Newmarket than your cards seem to be doing tonight. Isabella, darling, do ensure the fire is banked before you retire. The draughts in the north wing are rather severe tonight." With a pleasant, utterly unbothered nod, he withdrew to his study, leaving Isabella stewing in her own emerald silk, her guests suddenly feeling terribly small and foolish. 2 days later, she escalated. She ordered her mare saddled and rode through the centre of the local village entirely astride, eschewing the modest side saddle like a wild highwayman, her hair escaping its pins to stream in dark, curly ringlets down her back. The vicar nearly dropped his parish ledgers into the mud. The blacksmith paused his hammer in open-mouthed shock. When she returned to the manor, flushed with triumph and covered in mud splatters, she found Alistair waiting for her in the courtyard. He did not offer a lecture on propriety. He merely held out his hand to help her down, his expression perfectly serene. "An impressive display of horsemanship, Lady Isabella," he said smoothly as she ignored his hand and slid down the mare's flank herself. "The ostler tells me your seat is remarkably secure. If you intend to break the rest of our colts this spring, do let him know. It will save me the cost of hiring a groom." Isabella stamped her booted foot against the gravel, her chest heaving with hot frustration. "Are you a man or a statue, Alistair? Do you possess a single drop of real blood, or are you truly made of nothing but ledger ink and church sermons?" "I am a practical man, my lady," he replied, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her parted lips before rising to meet her furious stare with a cool, maddening calmness. "And anger is an incredibly inefficient expenditure of energy." But as the weeks ground onward and the first heavy snows of December cloaked Blackwood Manor in a suffocating shroud of white, the architecture of their war began to shift. The drama mutated from a battlefield into something far more dangerous, a slow, suffocating intimacy. Alistair, she realized with a growing sense of panic, was manipulating her in return. He did not use rules, covenants, or masculine edicts. He used observation. He memorized her. One morning, Isabella came down to the library to find her breakfast waiting by a freshly stoked, roaring fire. The tea was not the standard Earl Grey the household usually brewed. It was a rare, smoky Lapsang Souchong, the exact blend she had once casually mentioned preferring during a dinner in London 3 months ago. Beside the tray lay a small, leather-bound volume of poetry by Lord Byron. It was a book she had deliberately hidden beneath her pillow, assuming no one had seen her reading it. A note in Alistair's precise, elegant script rested upon the cover, for the cold mornings. "The fire will stay lit until dusk." Isabella sat down, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the leather binding. A hollow, aching weight blossomed in her chest. It was far easier to fight a tyrant than a man who saw through her armour. Later that afternoon, she was standing on a library stool, searching the upper shelves for a historical text to distract her racing mind. The stool was old, its joints creaking beneath her weight. As she reached for a heavy folio, her foot slipped. Isabella gasped, bracing for the hard impact of the floor, but the fall never came. 2 powerful hands caught her around the waist, lifting her effortlessly from the steps. Alistair held her against his chest for a single suspension of time. The contrast between them was devastating. She was all soft wool and frantic, pulsing heat. He was a wall of muscle and steady, unyielding strength. The scent of rain, wool, and fresh tobacco enveloped her completely. He set her feet upon the Persian rug, but he did not immediately release her. His hands remained anchored to her waist, his thumbs tracing small, slow circles through the fabric of her dress. Isabella looked up, her breath hitching in her throat. For the first time, the granite mask had slipped. Alistair was looking down at her with a raw, dark intensity that made the blood roar in her ears. His grey eyes were no longer winter seas. They were a raging, turbulent storm. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up. His long fingers brushed a stray, unruly curl away from her cheek, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of her jawline. The touch was so tender, so completely devoid of aggression, that it terrified her more than any threat could have. "You should be more careful, Isabella," he whispered, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated against her skin. "You are terribly fond of playing with edges, but some heights are too dangerous to fall from." For a breathless, agonizing second, she thought he was going to kiss her. Every nerve in her body screamed for him to do it, to break the contract, to shatter the lies, to bridge the agonizing distance between them. Her eyes drifted shut, her lips parting in a silent, terrified invitation. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure vanished. Alistair stepped back, his expression locking back into a mask of impeccable, polite distance. "I shall have the butler replace that stool," he said quietly, bowing his head before turning to leave the room. Isabella sank into the nearest armchair, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, her hand rising to touch the spot on her jaw where his skin had burned against hers. She was trembling. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was no longer fighting to escape her marriage. She was fighting to escape the terrifying, undeniable truth that she was falling in love with her husband. Chapter 4. The Thaw of Granite. The snow arrived in earnest 3 days before the solstice, burying the valleys of Yorkshire under a suffocating, blinding white blanket. The wind howled against the leaded panes of Blackwood Manor like a living thing, rattling the loose shutters and driving the frost deep into the floorboards. Inside the library, the world had shrunk to the radius of a single leaping hearth fire. Isabella paced the perimeter of the room, the hem of her heavy woolen gown sweeping over the faded Persian rug with a frantic, rhythmic hiss. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine and old leather. Across the room sat Alistair. He was at his desk, a single candelabra illuminating the sharp angles of his face as he dipped his quill into an inkwell. Dip, right, page turn. The sound of his steady, methodical work was a slow torture to her frayed nerves. For 3 days, the storm had trapped them in this forced intimacy. For 3 days, he had been nothing but perfectly polite, devastatingly attentive, and utterly unreachable. Every time she looked at him, she felt the phantom heat of his knuckles against her jaw from weeks before, a memory that made her blood run hot and her chest ache with a desperate, hollow longing. "Stop it," she suddenly snapped, her voice cracking across the silent room like a pistol shot. Alistair paused, his quill hovering a fraction of an inch above the paper. He did not look up immediately. "Stop what, Isabella? Stop breathing like that. Stop pretending that we are two strangers waiting for a train. Stop sitting there like a monument while I am losing my mind." She marched across the room, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, volatile heat, and slammed her palms down onto the surface of his mahogany desk. "Fight me, Alistair. Demand that I leave you alone. Tell me I am a menace. Lock me in my room. Do something. Just stop treating me with this damnable polite indifference." Alistair slowly set his quill down. He finally raised his head, and the sheer exhaustion in his grey eyes made her breath catch. The granite mask was gone, replaced by a hollow, strained weariness that made him look human, vulnerable, and entirely exposed. "You want to fight, Isabella?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that vibrated through the quiet room. "You want me to break the polite fiction we have constructed?" "I want the truth," she whispered back, leaning closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I want to know why you won't fight back." Without a word, Alistair reached into the deep drawer of his desk. He did not pull out a weapon or a legal brief. Instead, he dropped a massive, heavy ledger, bound in cracked pigskin, directly onto the desk between them. He flipped it open to the first page, then the second, then the third. Columns of numbers, written in his own precise hand, were slashed through with heavy strokes of red ink. Debt, foreclosure, interest rates. "Look at it," Alistair commanded softly, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind outside. "That is the grand estate of Blackwood. Those are the ledgers of my father's failures and my own. For 5 years I have traded every piece of family silver, every painting, every acre of timber just to keep the roofs over my tenants' heads and to keep my younger sisters from the degradation of the poorhouse." Isabella stared down at the pages, her anger evaporating, replaced by a cold, numbing shock. She saw the dates. The final notices of foreclosure were dated just days after their wedding. "Your father did not buy me, Isabella," Alistair said, standing up slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. "I went to him. I begged for your hand, because your dowry was the exact sum required to buy back the mortgages on this estate. I am a bankrupt, a failure, a man who sold his freedom and his pride to save his family." He walked away from the desk, standing before the roaring hearth, his shoulders slumped under a weight she had never seen before. "I do not fight you because I have no right to. You are entirely justified in your hatred of me. I trapped you in a marriage you did not want, all to save myself." Isabella stood frozen by the desk. For months she had believed she was fighting a pawn of the patriarchy, a safe, arrogant man who wished to tame her wildness. Instead, she was looking at a man who carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders, a man who had sacrificed his own honor to protect the people he loved. Her hellion act, her scandalous card games, her riding astride, they were childish tantrums compared to the quiet, agonizing battle he had been fighting every single day. Slowly, her boots making no sound on the rug, she crossed the room. She stopped just behind him. "I don't hate you, Alistair," she whispered. He flinched as if struck, his back tensing. "You should." "I don't," she repeated, her voice steadying as a fierce, warm certainty bloomed in her chest. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed her hand flat against the broad expanse of his back. Through the wool of his coat, she could feel the heavy, rapid thud of his heartbeat. "I spent my entire life fighting because everyone wanted to control me. My father, my suitors, the ton. They wanted a pretty doll to display. I thought you were the same, but you see me. You let me burn and you didn't try to put the fire out." Alistair turned around with a sudden violent swiftness. His hands came up to catch her upper arms, his grip tight, his grey eyes blazing with a desperate, tortured intensity. "Isabella, you do not understand. If I touch you, if I break that contract, I lose the only piece of honor I have left. I promise to give you your freedom after a year." "To hell with the contract," she sobbed, the last of her walls crumbling to dust, "and to hell with my freedom if it means leaving you." The dam broke. Alistair groaned, a low, ragged sound torn from the deepest part of his chest, and pulled her into his arms. The collision was fierce, desperate, and entirely devoid of the polite decorum they had practiced for months. His mouth came down on hers with a bruising, hungry passion that tasted of truth, relief, and months of unspeakable yearning. Isabella gasped into the kiss, her hands flying up to tangle in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer until there was no air, no space, no cold draughts left between them. The heat of the fireplace roared behind them, but it was nothing compared to the fire consuming her from within. He lifted her against him, his powerful arms locking around her waist, anchoring her to him as if she were the only stable thing left in a dissolving universe. When he finally pulled back a fraction of an inch, his forehead resting against hers, they were both breathless, their chests heaving in perfect unison. Alistair's thumbs smoothed the tears she hadn't realized she'd shed from her flushed cheeks. "I have loved you since the moment you snapped your fan in your father's face," he whispered against her lips, his voice raw and shaking. "You were an absolute terror, and I was entirely undone." Isabella laughed through her tears, tightening her arms around his neck. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the suffocating constraints of her world. In the arms of the granite monument, the Hellion had finally found her sanctuary. Chapter 5: The Saviour in the Shadows. The snows of December melted into the fragile greens of a Yorkshire spring, and by the time the first midsummer roses bloomed along the stone walls of Blackwood Manor, The ledger lines of debt had been rewritten in a steady, prosperous black. Yet the true test of their architectural alliance did not arrive in a ledger, but in a gilded carriage bearing the ducal crest of Averley. It was exactly 366 days since the parish register had been signed. Isabella stood at the tall window of the grand salon, her fingers lightly smoothing the soft linen of her high-necked morning gown. There were no ruby silks today, no performative scandals. Her dark, curly hair was piled loosely upon her head, caught in a silver comb Alistair had given her for her birthday, bought with money he had earned from his own freshly restored timber mills, not her dowry. The heavy oak doors opened, and the Duke of Averley strode into the room, his countenance a mask of grim anticipation. He carried a leather portfolio beneath his arm, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting to find a disaster, or at the very least a weeping daughter. "Isabella," the Duke said, skipping any pretense of paternal affection as he stepped toward the table. "Mr. Ellis, I have arrived precisely at the term. I assume the past year has been as intolerable as I predicted. I have brought the legal counsel from London. The papers for the annulment are ready for signature, provided the terms of non-consummation are sworn." Alistair stepped forward from the shadow of the hearth, his posture as unyielding as granite, yet his eyes held a calm, terrifying confidence. He did not look at the Duke. His gaze remained anchored to Isabella. "Your Grace, your promptness is admirable. However, I believe your journey was entirely unnecessary." "What do you mean, unnecessary?" The Duke barked, frowning as he looked between them. He expected to find a broken hellion and a compromised pawn. Instead, he found a united front. Isabella walked slowly to the table, her steps elegant and entirely devoid of her old frantic rebellion. She looked down at the legal documents her father had laid out. "It means, Father, that there will be no annulment. The contract we held in private has been mended." "Amended?" The Duke scoffed, a dark flush rising in his neck. "Do not play games with me, Bella. You jilted two of the most powerful peers in the realm. You are a wild, unmanageable creature, and I forced you to this man to bring you to heel. If he has failed to tame you—" "He did not tame me," Isabella interrupted, her voice ringing out with a fierce, beautiful clarity that silenced the room. "He loved me, and more importantly, Father, he protected me, from you and from the monsters you tried to sell me to." The Duke froze, his eyes narrowing. What nonsense is this? Alistair reached into his breast pocket and produced a thick packet of yellowed letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. He laid them gently upon the table beside the annulment papers. "Your Grace," Alistair said, his baritone voice smooth but laced with a lethal edge. "3 years ago, when the Earl of Malmesbury courted your daughter, an anonymous informant leaked a packet of bank drafts to Lady Isabella, proving the Earl had gambled away his entire inheritance and intended to use her dowry to flee to the continent. A year later, when the Viscount attempted to force her hand, another anonymous letter revealed his history of severe violence toward his estate staff. Isabella did not jilt those men out of a hellion's whim. She fled them because they would have destroyed her." Isabella felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she did not brush it away. She looked at Alistair, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast it threatened to break her. She had discovered the truth only a week ago, hidden beneath the floorboards of his study, the drafts of those very letters, written in his precise mathematical hand years before they had ever formally met. "You?" the Duke stammered, looking at Alistair with a sudden pale shock. "You leaked those scandals? You ruined those matches?" "I did," Alistair said, stepping closer to Isabella, his long fingers finding hers and locking them tight. "I had observed Lady Isabella from afar for 2 seasons. I saw her fire, and I saw how the vultures of the Ton wished to extinguish it. I knew that eventually your patience would break and you would force her into a contract. So I spent 2 years constructing an image of such absolute, boring respectability that you would deem me the perfect weapon to subdue her. I approached you with the marriage proposal because I knew it was the only way to ensure she fell into hands that would value her freedom above her fortune." He had never been a pawn. He had been the architect of her salvation from the very beginning. Isabella reached out, took the annulment papers from the table, and without a single word of hesitation tossed them directly into the leaping flames of the hearth. The vellum curled, caught fire, and turned to ash before her father's eyes. "The dowry stays here, father," Isabella said, her ruby lips curving into a brilliant, triumphant smile. "And so do I. I have no need for an inheritance when I have found a man who handles my fire without ever asking me to burn less brightly." The Duke stared at the ashes, then at the two of them, two predators who had rewritten the rules of the game entirely to suit themselves. Realizing he had lost, he gathered his leather portfolio, offered a single stiff bow of his head, and swept out of the room, his carriage wheels soon crunching away down the gravel avenue. As the doors clicked shut, leaving them in the sunlit silence of the salon, Alistair turned to her. He pulled her against his chest, his arms winding around her waist with that familiar, desperate strength that always left her breathless. "The contract is truly burned, then?" he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with a profound, emotional relief. "We have a new contract now, Mr. Ellis," Isabella murmured, looking up into his winter-grey eyes, which were now filled with a warmth that could melt glaciers. "A lifetime agreement. No annulments. No secrets." "And no rules?" he asked, a rare, devastatingly handsome smile touching his lips. "Only one," she replied, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, "that you never stop weathering the storm." In the quiet grandeur of Blackwood Manor, the war had finally ended, leaving behind a truce born not of submission, but of a fierce, undeniable truth. For the greatest deception they had ever practiced upon the world was pretending they could ever live apart, proving that the only thing more dangerous than a hellion's fire is the granite that rises to meet it. If your heart found its harbour in this tale of masks and undeniable devotion, subscribe to journey with us into the next great romance. Leave your thoughts below. Did the architect's grand design steal your breath away?